Yesterday, in Ottawa, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney read a 61-page document for precisely 9 minutes, closed the folder, and walked out of a bilateral trade summit with the United States. He was followed by his finance and trade ministers, leaving the American delegation entirely alone in the room in under 15 seconds. That detail tells you this was not a spontaneous outburst. It was a planned strategic action, and it represents a tectonic shift in North American relations. This summit, 6 weeks in the making, was requested by Washington to resolve what economists have termed the most damaging trade conflict in the continent's history. The data frames the absolute critical nature of these talks for American industry. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, 417,000 American jobs depend directly on bilateral trade with Canada. We are analyzing auto workers in Michigan, energy workers in Ohio, and farmers in Iowa who ship grain to Canadian mills. A combined workforce servicing a trade relationship valued at nearly $700 billion annually. The summit was positioned as the final opportunity to restore stability. The American proposal presented in Ottawa, a summary of which has been obtained, demanded extensive Canadian concessions. These specific points included immediate elimination of retaliatory tariffs, full alignment of all Canadian trade agreements to American standards, and a joint oversight commission with an American chair holding veto power. In other words, unconditional economic alignment. It was written under the assumption that Canada required this deal to function. Carney's response was silent finality, a move designed to deliver a specific strategic message. The immediate significance of this 11 seconds of silent footage, now the most watched diplomatic clip in internet history, lies in its calculation. Carney, a known quant, did not just walk out of a meeting. He was walking out on an economic relationship. Warren Buffett, analyzing the event from Omaha, described the action as the single most powerful negotiating move possible, stating that the party that cannot walk away holds no power regardless of how large their economy. That detail tells that the leverage in this relationship has officially inverted. Washington is now realizing that Carney could leave the room because Canada, after 18 months of intensive economic transformation, no longer needed to stay. That transformation has included the rapid diversification of energy export routes and new operational trade agreements with the European Union, Japan, South Korea, and India. The United States, by contrast, has not decoupled its economy from Canadian resources and integration, particularly in automotive manufacturing. What that means is the United States needed this deal more than Canada did, but sent terms written as though the opposite were true. The silence that Carney left on the mahogany table in Ottawa is already generating material economic consequences in the United States. Governors of states heavily integrated into Canadian supply chains have registered immediate political fury, with the governor of Michigan condemning the 61-page proposal as a strategic joke and warning of the imminent price workers in his state will pay. This reaction is translating directly to market data, where automotive and agricultural equities in the United States have seen marked declines. What the structure of that American document reveals is a fundamental misreading by Washington of the strategic landscape. The proposal was built to leverage Canadian vulnerability that no longer exists in that extreme form. Instead of securing concessions, it precipitated a total diplomatic collapse. The administration attempted to coerce capitulation and instead demonstrated that it now holds few real cards on the negotiating board. The immediate structural implication is that the last diplomatic off-ramp for normalizing nearly $700 billion in annual trade has closed. Supply chain disruptions that were managed under the expectation of a resolution are now locked in as the permanent operating environment. American auto plants and agricultural exporters must now operate with the reality that these critical markets are structurally changing, with Canada demonstrably moving on to alternative global partnerships. The question of whether or not these 417,000 American jobs can survive this new reality, or if another diplomatic avenue can be built to save them, was unanswered as the Canadian delegation returned to Parliament. The sudden breakdown of the Ottawa summit left 417,000 American jobs in active jeopardy and erased nearly $700 billion in annual trade certainty within 9 minutes. This calculated silence from Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney shattered decades of diplomatic norms, shifting the relationship from integrated partnership to an explicit standoff. Washington now faces an inverted playing field, where its traditional economic leverage has been completely neutralized by a quiet, 18-month diversification campaign. To understand the mechanics of this shift, one must examine the operational data of Canada's global trade pivot. Between 2024 and 2026, Canada's non-U.S. trade volume increased by 34%, driven primarily by expanded maritime shipments via the newly completed Trans-Pacific energy corridors and deep water ports in British Columbia. This structural adjustment means that Ottawa has systematically redirected its critical commodities away from the American Midwest toward high-yield Asian markets. The data reveals that the domestic infrastructure was quietly refitted to handle independent global distribution long before the American delegation arrived with its list of demands. This infrastructure pivot is coupled with a profound monetary reallocation that threatens the structural dominance of the U.S. dollar in North American trade. Over the past 12 months, 42% of Canada's resource exports to the European Union and India were settled using the newly implemented Commodity Settlement Framework, a parallel financial architecture that completely bypasses dollar-denominated clearing networks. That sequence is not coincidental. It is a direct policy statement designed to insulate the Canadian domestic economy from American financial sanctions or tariff pressures. By decoupling its primary revenue streams from the greenback, Ottawa effectively stripped Washington of its most potent economic weapon before a single word was spoken at the negotiating table. The true strategic depth of this independence became clear when the Canadian Department of Finance released its quarterly macro assessment hours after the walkout. The report indicated that for the first time in bilateral history, the United States accounted for less than 50% of Canada's total energy export revenues, dropping from 78% to 46% over an 18-month window. What that means is the core premise of the American proposal, that Canada would face systemic insolvency without immediate U.S. market re-entry, was entirely obsolete. The White House was negotiating against a dependency model that had already ceased to exist. This fundamental miscalculation generated immediate, severe friction within the American political apparatus itself, exposing deep fractures between regional leadership and federal trade planners. Following the summit collapse, the governor of Ohio issued an emergency statement to state manufacturing boards, asserting that the federal approach treated a modernized sovereign economy like an economic territory, and the immediate consequence is the structural strand of 41,000 industrial jobs in my state alone. What that response reveals is a deliberate choice by state leaders to publicly assign blame to Washington's misread of Canadian leverage, breaking party lines to protect local supply chains. It signals to international observers that the internal cost of Washington's strategy is triggering immediate domestic political resistance. The resulting damage is now materializing inside the highly integrated American automotive corridors, where the lack of an active trade framework is forcing unprecedented corporate retrenchment. Internal corporate filings from 3 major Detroit auto manufacturers show a combined 18% reduction in near-term capital expenditure, specifically targeting engine assembly lines that cross the international border. This data demonstrates that the private sector is not waiting for a diplomatic resurrection. Instead, executives are actively pricing in a permanent or long-term disruption. The forward-looking implication is a permanent contraction of the American manufacturing base as companies structurally adjust to a hard economic border. This industrial contraction is mirrored by rapid adjustments within international capital markets, which have begun discounting American sovereign predictability. In the 72 hours following the Chateau Laurier walkout, international sovereign wealth funds reduced their holdings of U.S. Treasury bonds by a collective $14.2 billion, reallocating those capital reserves into diversified sovereign assets. This movement indicates that global institutional capital views the diplomatic failure not as a temporary trade dispute, but as a symptom of structural overreach that compromises domestic stability. The capital flight directly restricts Washington's long-term capacity to finance its own trade deficits without raising domestic borrowing costs. Simultaneously, Canadian trade officials have capitalized on the American diplomatic vacuum by fast-tracking regulatory alignment with alternative partners. The European Commission confirmed this morning that an extraordinary session of the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement Joint Committee has been scheduled to finalize zero-tariff protocols on advanced tech components. This rapid maneuver means that Canadian supply chains are being permanently integrated into European industrial frameworks, effectively shutting out American suppliers who previously held exclusive access under North American agreements. What this layout structurally achieves is the permanent diversion of Canadian purchasing power away from the United States. Faced with this systematic realignment, the White House issued a defensive clarification, stating that the 61-page document was intended as an initial baseline for iterative negotiation rather than a final ultimatum. However, the sequence of events contradicts this assertion, as the inclusion of a mandatory American veto on a joint oversight commission represents a structural demand that no sovereign nation could accept as a mere starting point. That framing confirms that Washington did not anticipate a peer-level rejection, exposing an analytical failure within the state planning apparatus that has left federal negotiators without a viable secondary strategy. As the corporate and political fallout deepens across the American heartland, the immediate geopolitical focus shifts from abstract diplomatic theories to a concrete, time-sensitive event. All eyes are now fixed on the upcoming emergency meeting of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, where member banks will review the sudden 2.1% depreciation of the US dollar against the Canadian currency. The outcome of that single closed-door session will determine whether the United States will weaponize interest rate policies to force capital back across the border, or if it will be forced to absorb the inflationary shock of a permanently decoupled northern neighbor. The immediate financial and political volatility triggered by the Ottawa walkout highlights a complex landscape where traditional economic coercion has collided with a fully realized diversification strategy. This transition from a highly integrated continental trade model to a fractured, multipolar framework signals that the operational baseline for North American commerce has fundamentally shifted. The failure of the summit does not represent a temporary diplomatic pause, but rather the execution of a pre-calculated pivot that alters the long-term strategic trajectory for every major actor involved. For Canada, the outcome confirms that its structural insulation campaign has achieved its primary objective, strategic autonomy. By anchoring its key resource streams to operational agreements with Europe, Japan, South Korea, and India, Ottawa has successfully reduced its vulnerability to unilateral tariff pressures from Washington. The implementation of the commodity settlement framework means that Canada can now sustain its domestic export revenues without relying exclusively on the US dollar clearing system. Moving forward, Canada's next logical step is to lock in its newly fast-tracked zero-tariff protocols with the European Commission, permanently embedding its supply chains into a broader global architecture and establishing its position as an independent, self-directed economic power. 4. The United States, this diplomatic collapse reveals the severe limits of attempting to project absolute regulatory and financial authority over an insulated trading partner. The immediate domestic consequence is the structural vulnerability of 417,000 workers whose industrial and agricultural livelihoods remain tied to an integrated supply network that lacks an active management framework. Washington's likely next move will be determined by the internal friction between local political leadership and federal trade planners, as states bearing the brunt of automotive and agricultural losses demand a return to realistic negotiations. The federal administration must now choose between absorbing the inflationary impact of a weakened currency and a fractured manufacturing corridor, or presenting a heavily revised, peer-level proposal that formally acknowledges Canada's sovereign diversification. For Europe and India, This breakdown represents an unprecedented window of opportunity to permanently capture high-value resources and market share that were previously monopolized by the United States. The acceleration of the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement protocols allows European industrial giants to integrate advanced Canadian tech components and secure long-term energy supplies on highly favorable terms. Similarly, India's expansion of its resource trade under the parallel financial architecture deepens its access to essential commodities without exposing its institutions to secondary U.S. regulatory penalties. These global powers will continue to expand their institutional footprints in Ottawa, capitalizing on Washington's self-inflicted isolation to reorient the gravity of global trade away from traditional North American pathways. The single most important takeaway from this entire sequence is that the traditional leverage structure of the North American continent has been permanently altered because asymmetric dependence is no longer a viable tool of statecraft. The 61-page American proposal failed not because it was too aggressive, but because it was built on an obsolete macroeconomic reality that ignored 18 months of deliberate Canadian infrastructure and currency decoupling. When a state successfully builds viable alternatives to its primary market, an ultimatum ceases to operate as a point of leverage and instead becomes an invitation for that state to exit the relationship entirely. The quiet closing of the door at the Chateau Laurier demonstrates that in the 21st century, absolute economic scale matters far less than the structural capacity to walk away.